The golden lattice of energy pulsed before her, its shifting glow casting jagged shadows across the obsidian floor. Princess Lysara traced a fingertip along its surface, the electric warmth licking at her skin, an ever-present reminder of her father's decree. No human shall touch you. No human shall claim you. It had been her prison since birth, this unyielding force field that separated her from the world. And tonight, on the eve of her 18th naming cycle, it separated her from him. On the other side, Commander Ethan Cross stood, his blue eyes burning with defiance beneath the stark lights of the Zanari royal chamber. A human. An outsider. An enemy in the eyes of her people. Yet, when he looked at her, it was not with reverence for an untouchable princess, nor with the calculated ambition of those who sought power. It was something else. Something dangerous. Lysara had never known what it meant to be desired, not in the way Ethan's gaze promised. You shouldn't be here, she whispered, voice barely carrying over the low hum of the barrier. And yet, he smirked. I am. Her fingers curled into her palm. He was reckless. Bold in the way only humans dared to be. Her father had warned her of their kind, brash, instinct-driven creatures that acted before they thought. But Ethan? He was methodical, calculated. Every move was measured, his confidence not arrogance but certainty. She should have turned him away. She should have called the sentries. Instead, she took a step closer. You don't fear death? She murmured. His smirk deepened. I fear many things, princess. But not death. His voice was rough with exhaustion, yet laced with something else, a quiet promise. Lysara had spent her life surrounded by Zanari nobles, warriors bred for dominance and control, yet none had ever spoken to her like this. Not as a prize to be won. Not as a duty to be fulfilled. But as a choice. Your father is watching, he continued, his gaze flickering to the observation spire above. And he's furious. A cold wave of dread coiled in her gut. She knew what this meant. High Lord Veilthor had already condemned Ethan before the trial had even begun. I can't save you, she admitted. His eyes softened. You don't have to. The weight of those words pressed into her, deeper than any force field ever could. Humans were strange like that, saying so little yet meaning so much. She wanted to understand them, these beings her father had spent a lifetime teaching her to despise. And yet, if the mere sight of Ethan ignited a war within her, what would his touch do? Her father's words echoed in her mind. The chastity lock is absolute. No human will ever be worthy of breaking it. Lysara wasn't sure what frightened her more, the idea that Ethan would fail, or the possibility that he wouldn't. Tell me why you're doing this, she breathed. Ethan's smile faded, something heavier settling in his features. He exhaled slowly, as if weighing the words before releasing them. Because you deserve a choice, he said finally. A choice. No Zanari male had ever granted her such a thing. She had been born into duty, bound to rules written long before she took her first breath. Her life had never belonged to her. But this human, this stranger, was willing to die for the mere possibility of setting her free. A sharp clatter shattered the moment. The great doors of the chamber flung open, and High Lord Veilthor strode in, his crimson battle robes trailing behind him like blood spilling across the polished floor. His angular face was carved from stone, his violet eyes burning with unmasked fury. Lysara barely had time to step back before two Zanari sentries seized Ethan's arms. I warned you, human! Veilthor's voice was a blade, cold and cutting. You will not defile what is sacred. Ethan gritted his teeth, muscles straining against the grip of the guards, but he didn't fight. He didn't need to. His silence alone was a challenge. Veilthor turned his gaze to Lysara, disappointment hardening his expression. You are my daughter, he said, his voice like distant thunder. And yet you let this thing corrupt you with his lies. Lysara swallowed, forcing steel into her spine. He has spoken no lies. The air in the chamber grew thick, suffocating. Veilthor tilted his head, assessing her. Then, with terrifying calm, he gestured to the sentries. Take him to the trial of blood and fire. Lysara's breath hitched. No. Her father turned sharply, eyes narrowing. You would beg for this creature's life? I would beg for justice, she said, voice steady despite the storm raging in her chest. Veilthor stepped closer, his towering presence casting her in shadow. Justice? He echoed, his voice dangerously low. Justice is the law of our people. The lock exists for a reason. The lock is a cage, she shot back. And you would rather see him die than admit a human might be worthy. Her father did not flinch. There has never been a worthy human. His gaze flickered to Ethan, contempt curling his lips. And there never will be. The guards yanked Ethan toward the door, but he did not look at them. He did not fight. He only looked at her. And in that moment, Lysara understood. This was not just about the trial. Not about laws or Zanari pride. This was a war her father had waged long before she was born, a war against the possibility that love, that devotion, could transcend species. That a human could hold the key to her freedom. And if there was even the smallest chance that Ethan was that key, then she would not let him die. Her hands curled into fists, her heart hammering in her chest as the doors slammed shut behind him. The trial of blood and fire had begun. And so had the war for her soul. Ethan's boots scraped against the cold stone floor as the Zanari guards dragged him into the arena. The scent of scorched metal and ozone clung to the air, a silent warning of the countless battles fought within these walls. The trial of blood and fire was not a test of skill. It was a spectacle, a public execution disguised as a challenge. Above him, the Zanari nobles gathered in the towering Colosseum stands, their bioluminescent eyes glowing like spectral embers. Among them sat High Lord Veilthor, his expression carved from stone. And beside him, her fingers clenched in her lap, was Lysara. Her lips parted slightly as their gazes locked. Run! Her eyes seemed to plead. But he wouldn't. Because he knew she deserved more than a cage. The arena's heavy gates groaned open, the sound reverberating through Ethan's bones. The first challenger stepped forward, a Zanari brute draped in battle-worn armor, his pale violet skin marked with ceremonial scars. He was nearly 7 feet tall, his elongated limbs coiled with raw power. The first trial is the test of endurance. A voice boomed from above. Survive, and you may advance. Ethan rolled his shoulders, measuring his opponent. Zanari warriors were faster, stronger, their reflexes honed beyond human limits. But they fought with precision, trained in rigid forms. Ethan, however, had fought in wars where battles were chaos, where instinct mattered as much as skill. The brute lunged. Ethan dodged, twisting his body just in time to avoid the Zanari's claws slicing through empty air. He dropped low, using the alien's own momentum against him, driving an elbow into his ribs. A grunt of irritation escaped the warrior, but not pain. All right. Let's see what breaks first, you or me. The Zanari came again, his strikes like a storm, brutal and unrelenting. Ethan blocked, parried, endured. His muscles screamed as the blows rained down, each impact rattling his bones. But he didn't fall. From the stands, Veilthor watched impassively, but Lysara leaned forward, hands curled into fists. He saw it, the flicker of something in her eyes. Hope. He had to give her something to believe in. When the Zanari launched his final, overextended strike, Ethan pivoted, catching the alien's wrist. With a sharp twist and a grunt of effort, he sent his opponent crashing into the dirt. The crowd roared in shock. The brute staggered to his feet, but the match was over. He had survived. The second trial came swiftly. The test of will. 2 Zanari warriors encircled Ethan, their weapons drawn. He had been allowed no armor, no blade. This wasn't about fighting, this was about breaking him. End this quickly, Veilthor commanded. They obeyed. The first struck low, a sweeping kick meant to cripple. Ethan leaped over it, twisting midair, but the second warrior was faster. A fist like iron connected with his ribs, sending him sprawling. Pain erupted through his body. He gasped for air, pushing himself up. His vision blurred, a metallic taste coating his tongue. He had been hit harder before. But here, there was no time to recover. No moment of reprieve. A boot slammed into his gut, forcing him back down. The crowd cheered. From the stands, Lysara's fingers tightened against the railing. The second Zanari warrior grabbed Ethan's throat, lifting him off the ground with ease. His vision darkened at the edges, lungs burning. Yield, the warrior growled. Ethan wheezed, forcing a smirk. I don't do that. And he slammed his knee into the Zanari's jaw. The alien snarled, dropping him. Ethan hit the ground hard but rolled to his feet. He was battered, bruised, but standing. Still standing. His resolve had not broken. From the balcony, Veilthor's expression remained unreadable. But Lysara's eyes shone with something fiercer than hope. Defiance. The test of will was over. He had passed. Only one trial remained. The test of devotion. Ethan barely had time to catch his breath before the final challenge was announced. But it wasn't another fight. No, this was something far worse. The arena floor shifted beneath him, panels retracting to reveal a chasm of flickering blue fire. Energy surged, crackling through the air. The final trial is simple, the announcer declared. Step into the flames and prove yourself worthy. Ethan's jaw tightened. A test of pain. A test of faith. The Zanari believed no human could withstand the sacred fire. It would sear through flesh, burn through bones, dissolve the unworthy. Ethan exhaled slowly. This was it. Don't! A voice cut through the noise. His head snapped up. Lysara. She had risen to her feet, her chest rising and falling with hurried breaths. Her father's glare pinned her down like a dagger, but she didn't falter. This is madness, she hissed. You'll die. He smiled, blood staining his teeth. Not yet. And then, without hesitation, he stepped forward. The flames exploded around him. Agony tore through his body. The fire wasn't just heat, it was alive, sentient, twisting through his veins like molten chains. Every nerve ignited in white-hot torment. His legs threatened to buckle. His mind screamed. But he didn't fall. Through the inferno, through the waves of excruciating pain, he saw her. Lysara. Her lips trembled, hands gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles turned pale. He had come this far. He would not break. With a final, guttural growl, Ethan drove himself forward, through the flames, past the agony, until the searing heat faded. And then, silence. He stood on the other side. The fire had not consumed him. The arena was deathly quiet. Even the nobles, once eager for his demise, stared in stunned disbelief. A human had passed all 3 trials. Ethan exhaled, his body shaking. His flesh was raw, wounds burning, but he was alive. He turned his gaze upward. Veilthor's expression darkened, but he did not speak. Instead, it was Lysara who moved. Before anyone could stop her, she descended the steps, her gown billowing behind her. The moment she reached him, she did something no Zanari had ever dared. She touched him. A sharp gasp rippled through the Colosseum. The barrier had shattered. And for the first time in her life, Lysara felt warmth. Ethan's breathing hitched, his body wrecked with exhaustion, but he managed to smirk. Told you, he rasped. Not yet. The air in the Colosseum was thick with silence, the weight of 1,000 unspoken words pressing against the gathered Zanari nobles. Every eye was trained on Lysara, standing before Ethan, her trembling fingers still resting against his seared, battle-worn skin. A human had survived the trial of blood and fire. And now, a Zanari princess had broken the most sacred law. Lysara should have recoiled. Should have let fear dictate her actions, should have bowed her head beneath her father's glare and stepped away. But she didn't. She stood firm, her fingertips grazing the raw edges of Ethan's burns, feeling the heat still rising from his skin. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. He just watched her, breathing raggedly, exhaustion evident in every inch of his battered form. Above them, Veilthor moved at last. Guards! He commanded, voice sharp as tempered steel. The Colosseum erupted into motion. Elite Zenari enforcers, adorned in ceremonial battle armor, descended from the high walls, weapons gleaming under the ethereal glow of the twin moons. Ethan swayed but remained upright, muscles coiled despite his obvious pain. Lysara could feel it, the raw, unyielding defiance emanating from him. He wasn't afraid. Even now, even after the agony of the trials, he stood as if ready to fight an entire empire with nothing but his will. "Take him!" Veilthor ordered. The guards advanced. Lysara's heart thundered. No. Instinct roared through her, something primal and unshakable. Before she could second-guess herself, she stepped between Ethan and the advancing warriors. "Stand down." A single command, spoken not as a daughter pleading for mercy, but as a royal issuing an order. The guards hesitated. Veilthor's expression darkened. "Do not test me, Lysara," he warned. But the fire inside her had already been lit, and she could no longer ignore the truth burning beneath her ribs. This was never about Zenari purity. It was never about protecting her. It was about control. And she was done being controlled. "He passed the trials," she said, lifting her chin, voice steady despite the tremor of adrenaline coursing through her veins. "By our own laws, that makes him worthy." A murmur rippled through the gathered nobles. She wasn't wrong. The trials were sacred, designed to prove strength, resilience, and worthiness. Not a single human had ever survived. Until now. Until Ethan. Veilthor's jaw tightened. "You twist tradition to serve your weakness." Weakness. That word. Again. It had been whispered in her ears since childhood, ingrained in her like a curse. Love is weakness. Compassion is weakness. Desire is weakness. But was it? She turned to Ethan. His breath was unsteady, but his gaze was unbroken. He had endured pain for her, humiliation, fire, and still, he stood. If that was weakness, then the Zenari had been blind for centuries. "I am not weak," she said softly, then louder, turning back to her father. "You claim love is weakness. That humans are weak. But he stands before you, burned and bleeding, and still defies you." Her father's expression darkened. Lysara pressed on. "If he is weak, then what does that make you?" A sharp intake of breath rippled through the gathered nobles. Even the guards hesitated. Veilthor's fingers twitched at his side, his knuckles whitening. For the first time in her life, Lysara saw hesitation in his eyes. And she pushed. "You said no human would ever be worthy. That none could survive the trials." She gestured at Ethan, standing despite his wounds, despite the fire that had nearly consumed him. "You were wrong." Silence. For the first time in her life, her father had no immediate response. A slow realization unfurled in the pit of her stomach. She had power here. Not just because of who she was, but because of what Ethan had done. The murmurs among the nobles grew. This was not the outcome they had expected. Many had gathered to watch a human die, not to witness him stand victorious. And now, their princess was challenging their leader's decree. Veilthor's eyes flicked toward Ethan, and for a fleeting moment, Lysara saw it. Not just fury. Not just defiance. Fear. Because this was no longer just about one human. This was about change. The great High Lord of the Zenari was realizing, too late, that something had shifted. That he had lost control. Ethan coughed, pulling her attention back to him. He was still on his feet, but barely. The fire had taken its toll. His skin was marked with fresh burns, the scent of scorched flesh still lingering in the air. Yet when she met his eyes, he smirked, as if he hadn't just defied an empire. She exhaled, stepping closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "You're insane." His grin widened slightly, despite the pain. "Wouldn't be the first time I've heard that." She fought the sudden, inexplicable urge to laugh. What was this feeling? This unfamiliar warmth curling in her chest despite the chaos unraveling around them? It was dangerous. And intoxicating. Her fingers twitched at her sides, her body screaming at her to reach out again. To touch him. Instead, she curled her fists, locking her emotions behind a carefully constructed wall. "We need to get you out of here," she muttered. His smirk faltered slightly. "Yeah? And how exactly do you plan on doing that?" That was the problem. There was no plan. She had stepped into this firestorm without a second thought, drawn by something she couldn't yet name. Now, she had to finish what she started. Lysara turned back toward her father. "I claim him," she announced, her voice steady, ringing through the Colosseum. The nobles stilled. Veilthor's fingers curled into a fist. "You cannot!" "I just did." Another collective gasp rippled through the crowd. No Zanari noble had ever claimed a human. It was unthinkable. And yet she had spoken the words aloud. A challenge. A defiance. A declaration. Her father's expression was pure fury. Ethan chuckled beside her, low and rough. "You sure know how to make things interesting, princess." She ignored him. She had played her hand. Now, she had to survive it. Veilthor's eyes burned into hers, his voice cold. "If you stand by this, Lysara, there will be no turning back." She knew. And she met his glare with steel in her spine. "I know." The High Lord exhaled, his fury simmering into something darker. "So be it." He turned, motioning to the guards. "Take them both." Lysara's pulse spiked. Ethan tensed beside her. The guards moved. And just like that, the war had begun. The air crackled with tension as Lysara and Ethan stood side by side, surrounded by Zanari enforcers. The Colosseum that had once been a stage for his execution was now a battlefield of shifting loyalties. High Lord Veilthor rose from his throne, his robes a cascade of scarlet and obsidian, his expression carved from ice. "You shame yourself, Lysara," he said, voice cutting through the charged silence. "You align yourself with a creature of flesh and frailty, a species that should never have dared to touch you." Ethan let out a sharp breath, his stance tightening despite the pain lacing his body. "You're really into this whole humans are inferior thing, huh?" he muttered. Lysara bit back a smirk, but her heart thundered in her chest. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. "I align myself with a warrior who survived your trials," she countered, stepping forward. "A warrior your own laws have deemed worthy." The murmurs in the stands grew louder. Some of the nobles were shifting uncomfortably, casting uncertain glances at one another. The law was absolute. If Ethan had passed the trials, he was not unworthy. But Veilthor would never accept that. His jaw clenched, his gaze darkening. "Then you leave me no choice." With a flick of his wrist, the celestial forge rose from the center of the arena, a monolithic construct of gleaming obsidian and intricate energy sigils. The sacred binding mechanism, the very device that had sealed Lysara's fate before she was even born. The iron lock, the chastity seal placed upon her, had been a symbol of control, of absolute Zanari dominance over her future. And now, it would decide whether she would ever be free. Lysara's breath caught as the forge came alive, humming with ancient power. "This is the final test," Veilthor announced, his voice resonating across the chamber. "If the human is truly worthy, then let the lock be broken." The entire Colosseum fell deathly silent. Ethan frowned, stepping closer to her. "What does that mean?" Lysara exhaled shakily, her throat tight. "It means the lock has a will of its own." It was no ordinary device. The iron lock was a fusion of Zanari technology and ancient magic, designed to remain unbreakable unless a being of true worth, one who could match the soul of the bonded, touched it. Only one hand had ever been allowed to release it. Her father's. Ethan's gaze sharpened. "So this thing decides if I'm worthy?" She nodded, voice barely above a whisper. "If it rejects you, you'll die." His lips pressed into a thin line. "Of course. Because surviving a fire pit wasn't enough." Lysara wanted to stop him, wanted to tell him to turn back, but she knew Ethan wasn't the kind of man who backed down. And so, as Veilthor watched with cold triumph, Ethan stepped toward the celestial forge. The moment his fingers brushed against the lock, the world shifted. A deafening boom echoed through the arena as light exploded from the device, a swirling storm of energy, too bright to endure. The sigils flared to life, wrapping around Ethan's wrist, sinking into his skin like living tendrils of fire. Lysara's breath caught. The forge was testing him. His body convulsed, knees buckling, but he did not let go. He clenched his jaw, refusing to yield to the raw power surging through him. The lock fought back. It was an ancient force, one that had imprisoned her for 18 long years, denying her the right to choose her own path. And now, it was facing something it had never encountered before. A human who would not submit. Ethan gritted his teeth, the veins in his arms standing in stark relief as the energy wrapped around his form, attempting to break him, to judge him unworthy. But he held on. He fought. For her. And then, the energy shattered. The arena trembled as the sigils dissolved, and with a final, searing crack, the lock broke apart, pieces of molten metal clattering to the ground at Lysara's feet. A stunned silence fell over the Colosseum. She reached up instinctively, her fingers brushing against the smooth skin of her abdomen where the lock had once been bound. It was gone. For the first time in her life, she was free. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, emotions surging in a chaotic rush. And then, before she could stop herself, she turned and threw herself into Ethan's arms. His body was battered, his skin still hot from the forge's trial, but he caught her effortlessly, his grip strong, secure. Their foreheads touched, their breaths mingling. "You did it," she whispered, her voice breaking. He huffed out a tired laugh. "Would have been really embarrassing if I didn't." Lysara let out a breathless, half laugh, half sob, pressing closer, feeling his heart pounding as wildly as her own. For the first time, she felt warmth, not from fire, but from him. From the human who had shattered her chains. But the moment of triumph was short-lived. A cold, sharp voice cut through the air. "This cannot be." Veilthor's expression was unreadable, but his hands clenched into fists. His power, his control, gone in an instant. The nobles were murmuring now, shifting uneasily, some looking at Lysara with something dangerously close to respect. Ethan, still holding her, turned his head slightly. "So, does this mean I get to walk out of here, or are we still doing the whole kill the human thing?" Veilthor's face twisted in fury. He had lost. But he would not bow. With a final, venomous glare, he turned on his heel. "Leave. Both of you." The words hit harder than any blade. Lysara's fingers curled against Ethan's back. She knew what this meant. She had won her freedom. But she had lost her home. She swallowed hard, lifting her gaze to Ethan's. He looked at her, not with pity, not with regret, but with understanding. His voice was soft. "Where do you want to go?" Her throat tightened. "Anywhere. Everywhere. So long as he was there." She exhaled, taking his hand. "Somewhere the stars aren't watching." A flicker of amusement crossed his face, but beneath it, something deeper. Something unchangeable. He squeezed her fingers. "Then let's get the hell out of here." And together they turned toward the unknown. Free. At last.